are the black intellectuals and leaders who have factored into their analysis the rise of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, the so-called BRICS nations, and what their ascent means for us here in North America? What will their rise mean for the trajectory of white supremacy, which has bedeviled us for centuries? As the hegemony of the United States and the global economy recedes, as it inevitably will, what will that mean for our people who are mostly working class, selling their labor for a wage? What will that mean for auto workers, for example, who now must compete with labor in Mexico and China, amongst other nations? Of course, we received the answer today from the state legislators in Lansing, which is drive wages down to the level of many workers in developing countries. The problem there, among others, is that prices, especially housing prices in this nation, are not necessarily at the level of those in developing countries, which suggests that what the Lansing legislators will wind up attaining is increasing the homeless population in Michigan by an order of magnitude. But the question remains, where are our intellectuals and leaders who can place this dilemma in a global context the way our former leaders, like Douglass, Du Bois, Robeson, did? Other questions remain. Why is it that at a time when supersonic transport can whisk us nonstop to Cape Town or China or virtually anywhere on this planet within a matter of hours, and the internet allows us to whisk messages in a millisecond to virtually anywhere in the world, why is it that so few of our activists and intellectuals have a global analysis that recognizes that this is, in a sense, a global village, and that our fate is all tied up with the fate of struggling and working people everywhere, but particularly in Africa and the Caribbean? The short answer to these complicated questions will unfold in layers in my remarks this evening, but suffice it to say for now that unlike our brothers and sisters in Southern Africa who were able to attain liberation without throwing their leaders overboard, figures like Nelson Mandela in South Africa, Sam Nujoma in Namibia, here in the United States we were not as blessed, since, as I've detailed in a number of books and articles that can easily be found in the MSU library, we accepted a bargain whereby in return for the partial retreat of Jim Crow or racial segregation, we would go along with isolating and marginalizing the tallest trees in our forests, people like Du Bois and Robeson in the first place. Now, this may have seemed like a good idea at the time, but as time has passed, we now see that that fateful decision handicapped us, for not only were figures like Du Bois and Robeson persecuted, placed on trial, driven into exile, deprived of a decent livelihood, but their global approach to our plight was also marginalized and isolated, leaving us handicapped as we seek to comprehend a complicated present and future. Now, for those who may not be aware, Paul Robeson was an African-American born in Princeton, New Jersey in 1898, who became an All-American football player at Rutgers University, then graduated from Columbia University's law school before turning his back on practicing law and becoming a leading singer and actor, perhaps the first black star in Hollywood. In other words, he was a combination of Michael Jordan and Denzel Washington at a time when Jim Crow and racist terror ruled the land. This was an extraordinary accomplishment at any time, however, but what came next in his life was even more remarkable and sadly has not received the kind of dramatic and cinematic treatment it so richly deserves. Paul Robeson gave up his career in Hollywood because he objected to the stereotyped acting roles he was forced to perform. Unlike most singers, he refused to sing in concert halls where black American spectators were subjected to segregated seating. Unlike many singers today, he refused to perform lyrics that debased and denigrated his community. Instead, he began devoting more time to political activism, forming the Council on African Affairs in the late 1930s, which was devoted to a crusade against European colonialism in Africa, and then in the next decade to apartheid in South Africa. He began devoting more time to an organization called the Crusade Against Lynching. For those too young to recall, lynching was a ritual whereby thousands of black men and women were executed by white mobs, perhaps thousands between the end of the U.S. Civil War in the 1950s. For those who may not be aware, W.E.B. Du Bois was a scholar and activist who pioneered in his research on the African slave trade, wrote novels and plays, and was the chief figure behind the founding of the NAACP in 1909, an organization which is still with us. Ironically, he died in August 1963 in West Africa in exile on the same day in August 1963 that Martin Luther King Jr. was catapulted to fame as a result of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and of course his I Have a Dream speech. But sadly, Du Bois and Robeson, though they may be widely known within this enlightened community, are hardly remembered in Black America today, though these two men may have been the best educated we have produced, the best political organizers we've produced, the most politically astute, with the most connections abroad, and this latter point is particularly crucial. Du Bois spoke German, took a degree at the University of Berlin in the 1890s, traveled widely in Africa, China, and Japan. Robeson lived abroad for years and had knowledge of dozens of languages, many of which he performed in. Indeed, these international connections were used to persecute both of these men. In 1951, an 83-year-old Du Bois was indicted by the United States government for being an agent of an unnamed foreign power, thought to be the former Soviet Union, although it wasn't made clear, because of his leadership of the Stockholm Peace Appeal, which sought to outlaw nuclear weapons. During this same era, Robeson was barred from concert halls and denied the opportunity to earn a decent living. His income plummeted from the high six figures to the low four figures, for hundreds of thousands of dollars per year to about $4,000 per year. Why was this done? Why attack and seek to bring down two of the tallest trees in our forest? More to the point, why were Du Bois and Robeson persecuted at the same time that Jim Crow, the apartheid system of legalized racism, was in retreat? Why persecute two of our most visionary leaders at a time when we were about to be bathed in the blinding light of freedom of a sort? What would have happened in South Africa if the apartheid rulers of the 1990s had said, we're getting rid of apartheid, but Nelson Mandela and his fellow leaders of the African National Congress must remain jailed? This would have handicapped black South Africans immeasurably, making their present plight seem excellent by comparison. Which is precisely the point, for as you may know, the former US Vice President Dick Cheney was amongst the Republican Party leaders who demonized Mandela because of his closeness to the South African Communist Party, and the leaders of apartheid South Africa insisted that if he broke with this organization, he could be freed immediately, and this was a bargain that Mandela and the ANC rejected. It must also be said that some of our leading organizations and leaders in our community, though they embraced Mandela when he arrived on these shores amidst a tidal wave of publicity in 1990, after he was freed after 28 years in prison, were reluctant to embrace him previously, precisely because they were reluctant, a la Dick Cheney, to be seen as supporting a man reputed to be close to the South African Communist Party. My point here, and the point of my remarks tonight, is simply this: in order to understand how and why we were enslaved, and why we were able to abolish slavery, and how and why we were able to erode Jim Crow, and how and why Du Bois and Robeson were persecuted, and how and why we can begin to understand what the future holds for African Americans, one has to have a detailed and sweepingly historic understanding of the world, and not just the United States of America, particularly the international situation at any given moment in time. For other than our militant struggles of black people themselves, ourselves, the chief determinant of our struggle has been our ability to develop global support in our global ties, and thus, to answer the question, one of the principal reasons why Du Bois and Robeson were persecuted in the 1950s and 1960s, just as we were retreating, that is to say the United States was retreating from Jim Crow, was to make sure that that retreat from Jim Crow would only go so far. And by exiling some of our leaders and destabilizing others, that would guarantee that particular result. More than this, we also need to ponder another point, that in seeking support against slavery and racism, people of African descent have often sought assistance abroad on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that we embrace those who are often deemed to be hostile or perceived to be hostile by the rulers of the United States of America. This is nothing new. Before 1776, when this country embarked on the road to independence, we were often in alliance, that is to say Africans in North America, were often in alliance with the Spanish, particularly in Spanish Florida, against the British. Florida was under Spanish rule at that moment. Then after the United States was founded in 1783, we were often in alliance with the British against the United States. And subsequently in succeeding decades and into the 20th century, we were oftentimes in alliance with Mexico when it had contradictions with the United States, or Japan, or the Soviet Union, etc. Moreover, a major reason why legalized racism, Jim Crow, began to crumble in the 1960s is that the United States decided that Jim Crow was too dangerous for national security, particularly during a period when there was great fear and apprehension of Moscow. That is, the United States found it difficult to demonize Moscow for human rights violations when this nation itself was involved in human rights violations, speaking of Jim Crow and apartheid. So Jim Crow had to go. But the trade-off, since few things in life are free, was that figures like Du Bois and Robeson, who were seen as being too close to Moscow, were sacrificed so the rest of us could be free. In other words, Black America accepted a bargain, accept the retreat of legalized racism in return for turning your backs on leaders who were deemed as overly militant. This was a bargain that Black South Africans and Nelson Mandela refused to accept. The problem today, as we approach 2013, is that the conditions that gave rise to freedom in the retreat of legalized racism, that is to say apprehension about Moscow, no longer exist, at least not to the same degree. So what does that mean for freedom and racism in the United States? Moreover, when civil rights gains came, they emerged in the 1950s and the 1960s when the United States economy was expanding, when the United States was a dominant nation worldwide. But going forward in the 21st century, it is evident the United States will be experiencing a decline. There was a major report reported on the New York Times just today about this. And countries like China and India and Brazil in particular will be rising. So what does that mean for African Americans to reside in a nation in decline where there is little external impetus to attack racism, and where African Americans, as a result of the bargain that led to the persecution of Du Bois and Robeson, have few friends in the international community? To put it another way, did some of us see the Civil Rights era, the era of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as a permanent settlement, when in fact it was just a truce? And like any truce, can be ended unilaterally by either party. And might this shed light on the rise of the prison industrial complex, record rates of incarceration, promiscuous use of the death penalty, terrible infant mortality rates in our community, lagging life expectancy, attacks on affirmative action, and the right to vote, etc.? Might this shed light on the case of Trayvon Martin in Florida, which of course was not an exception, since those of us with longer memories know that he was preceded by Oscar Grant in Oakland, a black man slain by a police officer on camera with minimal consequences.